Crackanory, Too Cracked for TV, Mummy Business, by Barunka O'Shaughnessy, read by Catherine Parkinson.
Ask your grandfather what he did in the war, and the old man probably wouldn't answer, try to get in girls' knickers. My grandfather would. As a 21-year-old, Albert Small was billeted in London while preparing to join D-Day manoeuvres. His battalion's billet was in Bloomsbury, in the basement of what is now the Petrie Museum of Archaeology, the men's bunks nestled among a collection of priceless Egyptian sarcophagi. Bored of waiting for battle, the men amused themselves by desecrating the relics that had been stored in the basement to protect them from the infernos of Hitler's blitzkrieg. The soldiers used funerary masks as ashtrays, played football with the head of the high priest Nebuenanef, and mimed sex acts with the half-clad mannequin of a royal dancing girl. Their low drinks attracted the disapproval of a serious young lieutenant whose name is not important now, as he would shortly lose his short life by slipping on a wet cobble and braining himself on the sharp end of an anvil left lying on the curb by a careless blacksmith. The young lieutenant had been a scholar of archaeology and an amateur hierophant, so he knew a little of the language of ancient Egypt, and while he dreaded interrupting the soldiers' play, he dreaded the consequences of their blasphemous sport more. As the lads began to heave the lid off the granite sarcophagus of Queen Nefertiti, he cried out,
"Stop that, you fiends! I have a passing grasp of hieroglyphs, and I can tell you that if you lay so much as the end of your todger on this mummified queen, you'll bring down a horrible cloud of evil not only on us, but on all our descendants forever."
The chastised men were about to respond by throwing the lieutenant in the cursed sarcophagus and urinating on him, when the dinner bell called them and they stampeded off for their buddy beef and suet dumplings. My grandfather Albert was not one of the despoilers of artefacts, and nor did he fancy any beef and dumplings that night. He was too preoccupied with his inability to get any "how's your father?" Here he was in London, a city teeming with young women away from home doing their bit for the war effort, their morals loose and their gussets looser. Love had never been freer, but try as he might, it had so far evaded Albert. He was contemplating that he might die, never having so much as tongued an earlobe nor fumbled with the clasp of a stubborn brassiere, when he noticed a young lieutenant crying over Queen Nefertiti's open sarcophagus, while tenderly stroking her mummified face. Much as he would have liked to, there was no one else about, so Albert couldn't ignore the crying man. "Is there something in your eye, sir?"
"I tried to stop the men. Too late."
"Don't mind them, sir. They're just a bit itchy for action."
"Hear that? Oh, she's out."
"Who's that, sir?"
The sound of her immortal soul rising from eternal sleep. Oh, God help us.
He gave a morbid sort of giggle, followed by a teary burp. Then, with a droop-eyed glance at Albert, the young lieutenant walked out into the blacked-out night, and before even reaching the end of Mallet Place, slipped on the aforementioned wet cobble and fell brain first onto the aforementioned anvil. As D-Day loomed and his battalion moved on, Albert was invalided out with an ingrown toenail. He returned all alone to his billet at the Petrie Museum. What should have been a letdown for a young man expecting to prove himself on the battlefield turned out to be the opportunity Albert needed to prove himself in the sack. One clear June night, while his comrades were being blown apart on the beaches of Normandy, Albert popped into a pub not far from the museum for a pint of weak, warm beer, and to see if he couldn't at least pull the barmaid. As he cleared his throat to deliver a pre-rehearsed spiel, in walked Elsie, a 20-year-old air raid warden, in a fluster about a 1-inch gap she'd spotted in the pub's blackout blinds. Albert pulled his jaw off the floor and approached this officious peach of a girl. "How do?" tried Albert. "Excuse I for being so bold. Only I couldn't help but notice, and you'll think this daft."
"Whatever it is, I've heard it all before."
"Beg your pardon, miss, but I think you'll find you ain't heard this one. See, my billet's over the square at the museum, and blow me down sideways with a tin of sardines if you ain't the spit of the Pharaoh Queen Nefertiti what's holed up there in one of them sarcophaguses."
Elsie was nonplussed. She'd spent a long day pulling dead bodies from a soup factory turned to rubble by a doodlebug just over the Euston Road. Now here was some spotty Herbert spinning her a yarn about blood Egyptians. Still, she had to ask.
"What's a sarcophagus?"
"It's sort of a coffin made of rock."
"Charming, I'm sure." Elsie pursed her lips and made to leave, but Albert was sure his new tactic would score him a victory on a par with the Allies' success, though with slightly fewer casualties. He wouldn't let up.
You and her is absolute peace in an ancient Egyptian pod. As spooky as what it is, like you was the same human. Maybe you're related, or maybe you are the Queen, doomed to wander through time, trying to reunite with your lover king.
Albert wasn't sure where he'd got that last bit from, but it seemed to do the trick. You really ought to come down and see. Elsie sighed. I've bloody heard it all now. But she let Albert buy her a port and lemon. Several ports and lemons. Soon Elsie had forgotten she'd spent a day up to her armpits in body parts and mulligatawny, and was following Albert down the dark corridors of the Petrie Museum. By the light of Albert's hurricane lamp, the museum's exhibits seemed to leap and shudder from the shadows. A half-wrapped skeleton shimmied as they passed. A mummified cat licked its mummified lips, and 2 glassy eyes rolled in the sockets of a dead baboon's head. What do they want with all this old stuff? Elsie muttered. She'd spent the war digging up enough effects of the dead to fill 100 museums. Do you think our bits will end up being oogled by strangers in 1,000 years? Albert wasn't sure how to answer, so he laughed stupidly and squeezed Elsie's bottom. I'd like to oogle your bits. She slapped him, of course, but let go a little giggle to let him see he was on the right track. Albert grinned, pointed at a plaster bust of a pharaoh queen balanced on top of a packing crate behind Elsie's head. I told you was a spit of her. Elsie looked at the queen's blunt dark fringe, almond eyes and wide red mouth. Elsie was fat and blonde, with round blue eyes and a button-pink mouth. Albert was an idiot. They both laughed, and this time Elsie went in for a grope, and soon they were dry humping against the packing crate, thrusting and grinding with a vigour and enthusiasm that toppled the bus and sent it smashing down the stairs. Albert and Elsie stopped humping to look down at the ancient smithereens. They both sniggered, went at each other's mouths with their tongues a bit more, and then Elsie let Albert lead her wordlessly down 3 flights to his basement billet. As the idea of the love that was about to be made formed in the lovers' minds, they grew serious. A hush settled on them, cut only by the cold hiss of an unseen draught. Like the sound of a dying tyre, or the last rasping gasp of a terminal lung. Is that gas? Wondered Elsie uneasily. Some of these old buildings still ran on coal gas, and God knows if the burning bombs didn't sear the flesh to your bones and ignited bloody gas leak would. Albert pulled up short. There was no gas here. Looking for the source of the hiss, he held up the hurricane lamp, and for the first time Elsie saw the basement entirely. A cavernous room filled row upon row with the caskets of the ancient dead. Elsie was a tough girl, afraid of little, but even she was unsettled by the eerie melancholy of this place. She followed Albert along the line of coffins, lightly touching each finely painted gilded lid, wondering to what end all these bodies had been dragged so far from home. Could these precious lumps, swaddled and preserved for eternity, have known they'd end up forgotten in a basement, propping up the bunks of a battalion of sweaty squaddies? As they neared the unlidded sarcophagus at the far end of the room, they realised this was the source of the sinister hiss. What's in there? Albert turned to Elsie uneasily. What is it? I don't know. The lieutenant, he did say... Elsie leaned over to look inside the coffin. The hiss softened to a sigh as her hair brushed the bound-up hands of the mummified corpse. She couldn't make anything out. Give me that light, she said. But the lamp slipped from Albert's grasp, and with a vital flash of flame it went out. A face, mouth howling open and black, then shh, silence and black. No hiss. No sound. Albert? Tutting, Elsie rummaged in her bag for her air raid warden's torch. She clicked it on. Albert was not where he had been. What are you playing at? Albert? A sob like sadness made her turn, and there in the beam of her torch a young woman hovered, naked as mist, milky as fog, head turned but not turned, and what Elsie took for hair was in fact the yawning gory hole of a caved-in face. Hawks! She started and her torch failed right then, flickered off. Damn thing! She gave it a whack, it flickered back on, and there was Albert again, right by her. now smiling because they were alone, together, about to do the thing he had imagined doing almost every minute of every day of his adult life. S-E-X, the sex. Only one ever tell you you'd got a smashing mouth. Stop messing about, what was that thing? Do you mean this thing? Albert pressed Elsie's palm against his turgid todger. No, the thing, that thing! And he kissed her, and lifted her skirt and fumbled about with her bits like the other lads had told him to do before they had all died, when he was still dreaming about this moment, and the fumbling hit the spot because Elsie shivered and cooed and forgot the apparition, forgot the museum, the darkness and the death and all the horrors of the horrible war. In that moment all that was her and Albert and the woozy oozing pleasure of their bodies bouncing in unison like a loose gate clonking merrily in a warm wind. Elsie was propped on the ledge of the sarcophagus, her hips level with Albert's, as if the coffin were designed for their congress, or at least designed for the slow, deliberate congress of two seasoned lovemakers, not the over-animated, excitable rabbit-jigging of these two first-timers. Some 3 minutes of giddy coupling later, Albert gasped, "Oh, look out, I'm going to go off." Wait, puffed Elsie. And another 30 seconds in, "Can I go off yet?" And Elsie huffed, Go off, do it now." And astounded by the joy of going off, Elsie arched backwards too suddenly, and Fosbury flip-flopped into the open pit of the sarcophagus. She squawked, then more urgently, as she tried to scramble out, but propelled by a force, an invisible punch fell back in, flailing, tangling in a bundle of bandage and bone. "Get me out of here!" she howled, her clothes caught and ripping on a crunchy resin like the skin of a rancid creme brulee. Her struggles splintered the fragile remains of the Pharaoh Queen, shards of bone like pins skewering her skin, while Albert, pants down and still half aroused, lunged clumsily to help. But he misjudged and stumbled, caught his bell end on a carving of a dog and fell bodily against the lid. It teetered, rocking heavily, gained unnatural momentum till with a thud slid into the coffin, pinning Elsie thump to the crispy remnants of the mummy. Poor Elsie screamed. Oh God! Poor Albert couldn't shift the lid. Elsie's cries became more urgent. "Help me!" She soiled herself. Albert tried to use his weight to tip the lid, throwing himself onto it, praying he might release it just enough for Elsie to wriggle free. He strained and the lid started to rock back. Elsie felt the weight lift, felt her ribs release. She heaved for breath. That's it. If he could lift the lid a little more, she might shuffle clear, and she might not be crushed slowly to death by 1/2 ton of pink granite hewn from the rock by sorry slaves in the heat of a sun that burned brighter those millennia ago, when the Queen was young and foresaw the grim fate of her human remains and resolved to defy destiny with the potent she-magic of the cosmos that was known to humanity for a short time before it was crushed and supplanted by the tedious self-worship of male man-god monotheism. None of this crossed Elsie's mind as the lid started to rock back and she felt the weight lift. Hope crossed her mind, relief, and a fleeting promise to the universe to be a better person when she got out. But curses are curses, and what the young lieutenant didn't know, because his grasp of hieroglyphs was actually less than passing, was that the Queen required a fresh body to inhabit if she were to restore her soul to the grave. Any body would do, and it would have been Albert's if he hadn't got lucky that night in the warm, wet pub. Elsie was out from under the lid and reaching for the ledge to lift herself free when an explosive thud shook the whole room. A huge boom tore the top floor off the building, sent it smashing through the second, first and ground floors, to the basement and into the earth, where it lodged in lumps and started to burn. Whatever hope Elsie had had was lost. So many bombs landed and so many fires burned and so much conflict raged across the world that no one bothered to notice that no bomb nor gas had caused the explosion at the museum. 3 days later, Albert woke in hospital with a sore penis and no recollection of how or why. He was told he'd been found on the pavement with his trousers around his ankles and a nasty bump on the head. As his ingrown toenail was healing nicely and his amnesia didn't seem serious, he was past his fighting fit and sent to join what remained of his battalion in Holland, where he helped chase down the Nazis and end the war in Europe. Decades passed. Albert married, reproduced, bought a Betamax tape recorder and lived an ordinary life, until the day he accidentally recorded a documentary about the Petrie Museum. Instead of the Snooker World Championship, Albert saw a row of sarcophagi and an expert explaining that during the Blitz, everything stored here was destroyed except, miraculously, this granite sarcophagus, which was found sealed and as intact as the day the Queen Nefertiti was laid to rest 5,000 years ago. You can see the seal there with her hieroglyph on. Albert spat his tea halfway across the Axminster, shouting, "Oh my Christ on a bloody bike!" The whole memory of that night came back with a pie-regurgitating lurch of the stomach. Blue almond eyes, a blunt blonde fringe, and a mouth like a ripe fig that he wanted to lick, all blackened and bound, and how, oh how, could he have forgotten that extraordinary night with sweet, serious, yielding Elsie, entombed forever by the curse of the Egyptian queen? He never could tell my grandmother, his wife, what it was he'd remembered and why it gave him a slight erection. But he told me just before he died because he had to tell someone, and I'm telling you because if one day you break open that sarcophagus and find the remains of an air raid warden inside the remains of a mummy, I want you to know why.